Today I really wanted to chat about Battlefield 2042's map design and how we've actually got here. So in this video I'm going to deep dive into the history of Battlefield maps, taking a look at some of my favourites and the trajectory that's brought us to this point in Battlefield 2042. To start with, I'm going to cast ourselves all the way back to Bad Company 2 and look at a couple of the maps and the way they're laid out. I think it'd probably be more relevant to also look at Arica Harbour and Valparaiso specifically, seeing as we've got two new variants of those in 2042. Straight away when looking at both, you can see that the play spaces are relatively confined. Of course, the player counts are a lot smaller back then, so you immediately didn't need as much space on the map. But I think more importantly, we need to note the way the maps are shaped, and that is they are very linear. Of course, you can automatically boil this down to the fact that Rush was the main game mode in Bad Company 2, where you're attacking two MCOMs in a specific location at various stages along the map. So it made sense to build maps in a linear fashion, which had 3 or 4 different lanes, but were also wide enough to allow for vehicle play, and the increased destruction that they brought with the Frostbite engine. Stepping forward into Battlefield 3, I think it was much of the same, to be honest. Rush was still a frontline game mode, and the maps were still very linear. You only have to look at the likes of Damavan Peak, for example. And personally, I think even maps like Seine Crossing, which on the surface didn't feel as linear because of the boxed play spaces and the use of verticality in the buildings, still followed a similar pattern. I think there was a slight shift though when we reached Battlefield 4. Rush was no longer as much of a priority for the developers, they were focused more on the conquest side of things. So with that in mind, you can see the play spaces widen considerably, and increasing the amount of lanes in the map to maybe even 5 or 6, again to allow for different kinds of playstyles and for people to move around the map in more unique ways. Take the likes of Zavod 311 for example. While still being quite linear, there's plenty of open space for people to move around on the edges of the map, whilst also condensing firefights and infantry combat into smaller play spaces. And even though we went back in time historically, I do think Battlefield 1 felt very similar to Battlefield 4 in the way they designed the maps. Taking a look at Monte Grappa, you can see that the approach again was quite linear, but because of the whole map sloping on a hill, the verticality element played a massive part. Then we can quickly look at Ballroom Blitz, a slightly wider map, which again you can break down into several key play spaces. Out wide on the edges of the map were open fields, you can head more into the centre and the palace itself, which was ripe for infantry fighting. Ballroom Blitz was an example in BF1 of how they really tried to blend vehicle and infantry gameplay, essentially creating a melting pot where all types of players could enjoy their own experiences within the same game. To be honest, I think the paradigm shift was probably in Battlefield 5. If we think of Arras for example, the map obviously was centred around a village, with the fields on the outskirts, and objectives placed intermittently at different locations, whether that be in open fields or small barns and outhouses. But I think the key thing to note here is the lack of lanes on the map itself. You're obviously able to move around the map pretty freely because of the fields, but it also meant less predictability and potentially more chaos, purely through the lack of choke points and areas where you would know the enemy are going to be coming through. This brings me on to the tipping point, the map in particular which I feel has really shaped Battlefield and going into 2042, and that's Panzerstorm. Panzerstorm to me would fit very nicely into the 2042 ecosystem because of the way the map's laid out, the way it functions and the way it plays, obviously being dominated by vehicles with wide open expanses. There's very little areas in Panzerstorm which are going to be effective for infantry play, obviously with the little forest to the south and the couple of farm areas which are obviously there to be tug of war zones. Now again, this is all subjective, but to me Panzerstorm wasn't an enjoyable experience. I think it suffered greatly from a lack of lanes. Unless you were a heavily vehicle dominant player, it became incredibly hard to move around the map from objective to objective. What I'm going to do now is overlay Hourglass on top of Panzerstorm to give you a representation, or maybe to show the similarities rather, between the way this map shaped and also that of the previous map in Battlefield 5. You can see there's some direct similarities just because of how open and wide the map is, straight off the bat. So to me it's clear to see that this is the direction that DICE have been moving in terms of their map design. And again, it's not something that I'm particularly keen on. I am hopeful though that in future DLCs and new seasons in 2042, we do see the return of some slightly smaller, slimmer or more laned maps. Because at the moment, the only way you can get that semblance of an experience is by playing Breakthrough, because it is obviously condensing the map into smaller bite-sized chunks, and only a couple of objectives to actively fight over. Let me know down in the comments though what you think of 2042's maps. I'm keen to get other people's perspectives, especially if you enjoy them and what you do actually like about them. I'll be the first to admit that verticality in 2042 is paramount, and we can certainly see that in a lot of the maps that DICE have made. As always, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks again for your time, and I'll catch you all in the next one.